I thought if I came now, I'd beat you here, but I didn't. So you're on Obama time and I'm on Clinton time, right? Yeah, it's good to see you, Larry. It's good to see all of you here. Thank you for being here at the Kennedy School today. I'm honored to be here. Whenever I'm trying to find out what's really going on in the world, one of the first people I turn to is Larry. And we're at a time of enormous confusion and uncertainty about the world ahead. It's interesting at West Point, they now teach young officers that the world they're heading into can be best understood with an acronym, which they call VUCA, V-U-C-A, and it stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And it seems to me that's really what the world at large is now looking like. We've gone from talking about a new normal to a new mediocre. You've popularized, brought back into play secular stagnation. At a time when it looks like the American economy is gaining traction, there's now the IMF says the prospect for a recession or the possibility of a recession in Europe has doubled from 20 to 40%. It's a very confusing world to a lot of us. Can you help us straighten out sort of where we are and where we're going?
David, I think it's important to start with something positive, though there's going to be plenty of concern to talk about. If you look at the broad history of humanity in economic terms, it was a story of very substantial uniformity around the world until about 1800. Everybody was, by today's standards, very, very poor. Life expectancy was short everywhere. Starting with the Industrial Revolution in Britain, you saw a great divergence, and you saw a widening of inequality among the world's nations that basically trended upwards until the 1970s. And so you saw something that would have been unimaginable 200 years ago, standards of living in one country being 30 or 40 times standards of living in another country. For the last generation, we have seen a reconvergence globally. We have seen what we used to call developing countries, and we today call emerging markets, grow more rapidly than industrialized countries, and we have seen a process of catching up. I recently co-chaired a commission for the Lancet magazine on global health that concluded that it is within reach, with major efforts, that by 2035, global rates of child mortality will be comparable to the rates you observed in the United States or Western Europe in the 1990s. That is a transcendent level of human progress. It would represent averting 10 million deaths each year if it was achieved. So let's focus on the problems of today and the macroeconomic problems, serious as they are. But let's remember that in terms of human betterment, human emancipation, the reduction of pain, the exposure to a broad world for more people, that the period that we're all alive is actually quite unique in human history. That said, the process of economic growth globally faces a challenge today of a kind that it has not faced since the Second World War. Since the Second World War, the industrial world has experienced business fluctuations, in some cases quite serious business fluctuations. But there has been the capacity of monetary policy and central banks to regulate those business fluctuations. At times, they have stepped on the brakes too hard, and there have been recessions that were perhaps larger than they needed to be. At perhaps times, they have exercised insufficient restraint, and there have been serious problems of inflation. But fundamentally, there has been the capacity, albeit imperfectly, to regulate the pace of economic activity using interest rates and monetary policies as an instrument. That efficacy came to be in doubt over the last generation in Japan. When I joined the Clinton administration, David Gergen joined the Clinton administration a couple months later in 1993, the concern was that Japan would overtake and surpass the United States. One of our Harvard colleagues had written a book that was pretty close to being the #1 bestseller in both Japan and the United States, called Japan as #1. The expectation was that Japan would grow at 3 to 4% a year. Americans went to Japan to learn about macroeconomic management, to learn about best business practices, to learn about how to become competitive. What happened? None of that played out. Some of that was for a variety of structural reasons. Silicon Valley turned out to be much more innovative at consumer electronics than the Sonys and the Panasonics proved to be in terms of enduring advantage. But much of it had to do with the fact that a large financial bubble burst in Japan. Interest rates were reduced to 0, but it wasn't enough. And Japan became a deflationary economy. Demographics moved against Japan, and it now suffers from a shrinking labor force. And for a generation, growth in Japan has averaged less than 1%. And measured in GDP terms, the income of Japan in yen is less than it was a decade ago. And once interest rates were at 0, there was a limit to what the central bank could do. People regarded Japan as a special case. It is now far from clear that they were right to so regard Japan. Europe today, 7 years after 2007, is just about where Japan was 7 years after their bubble burst at the end of 1989. Weak demography, growing deflationary pressures, the limits on what the central bank can do, policymakers saying platitudes about structural reform and not doing very much, and the inflation rate keeps coming down. There was a moment yesterday when the US 10-year interest rate was at 1.86%. That was probably a somewhat artificial technical factor for a few moments in the bond market. But in the broad sweep of things, 215 with 2.15% for 10 years, which is where it is right now, is actually a remarkably low figure for an economy 5 to 6 years into a process of economic recovery. You could say 2's okay, you could say 0 for the Treasury bill rate is okay, but very unlikely that we've seen the last recession in the United States. And by the way, while the outlook for the United States looks good, never forget that there has not been a single recession since the Second World War that was predicted 1 year in advance by the Federal Reserve Board, the IMF, the sitting administration, the Congressional Budget Office, or the consensus of economic forecasters. Not a single one. And so there is the possibility in the United States as well that the next recession will come, and there is no further room to reduce interest rates. And there is a deflationary psychology that has taken hold, which is why there is such a desire on the part of so many banks and so many corporations to hold cash. And so, as Keynes pointed out a long, long time ago, when there's a very strong desire to save and only a limited desire to invest, it is not so easy for markets to clear. And when the mechanism that makes the market clear, a falling interest rate, is constrained in various ways, it is that much more difficult. And so the prospect is, and that's what all these terms, I like secular stagnation, Muhammad Al-Arian spoke of a new normal, Christine Lagarde spoke of a new mediocre. I must say I don't particularly see after 5 years what's new about the mediocre.
You don't see what's new about normal either.
I don't see what. Yeah, at least he said it early. At least he said it 4 or 5 years ago. It is, I think, a serious challenge, and part of the way you accommodate is you define downwards your aspirations, and that's what's happening. Here it is. If you look at the American economy and you draw a trend line of GDP ending in 2007, and you look at where we are today, we are between 10 and 11% below that trend line. If you ask, how big is the GDP gap? How short are we of our potential? You'll get different estimates. The highest of them will be 4%. And so we are defining what constitutes acceptable. Most of what we've lost, we've now defined as acceptable. And we're in a set of further rolling revisions downward. And so one has to ask, how is the industrial world performing? And one has to ask, in the face of an industrial world that is not performing so well, won't that have consequences for a developing world where, at the end of the day, the successes we've observed, and there have been a number, have tended to be based on export-led growth, either export-led growth because of development of efficiency and low-wage production, or export-led growth because of the possession of substantial commodities. And both of them are dependent in one way or another on the success of the industrial world. And so it seems to me a very challenging moment for the global economy in a medium-term sense, and that's even before you reach the longer-range structural issues around rising inequality. What's to be done? Clarity of thought is a useful beginning. The world's problem is not too little supply, it is too little demand. The world's problem is not inflation, it is incipient and prospective deflation. The world's problem is not too much spending and too little saving, it is too much saving and too little spending. If we began with a recognition of those facts, we would have a better chance of finding suitable solutions. Unfortunately, in much of the political debate, in much of the industrial world, these things are cast as a kind of morality play. We are suffering because we have been profligate. We must therefore become less profligate. I am as concerned or more concerned about the next generation, about the economy my children and their children will, when they have them, will inherit as anybody else. But if you ask me, what do I worry about on behalf of my unborn grandchildren? Do I really worry that they will be impoverished by the debt we entered into at a 2.5% interest rate denominated in dollars that we print? I can't honestly say I'm very worried about that. Do I worry, on the other hand, that we have a decaying and if not crumbling infrastructure in many areas? That the air traffic control system in the United States is based on vacuum tubes? Some of the younger people here probably don't know what vacuum tubes are. They're what used to make black and white television sets work. Do I worry that there's crumbling paint off the walls in 30,000 American schools? Do I worry that we are systematically crippling with inadequate compensation and politically restricted hiring practices the civil service that makes government effectively function? Do I worry that, and this is a phenomenon I don't understand very well, but I'm convinced is very important. Some of you may have walked across the Charles River. If you did walk across the Charles River from here, you saw a bridge, and you saw that they were doing a bunch of construction work on that bridge. Now, the Charles River, it's a fair-sized river. Charles River is not nearly as big a river as the Rhine. Patton built bridges over the Rhine in a day. And those bridges took tanks, really big tanks, a day. And there were tanks going over the bridges. The repair of that bridge has been going on for 3 years. And if you call them and you ask them, they tell them that it's going to take another year. This is not the mark of an effectively functioning society that is preparing for the future. And that is our problem for the future, not a bunch of stuff about how we're borrowing money at 2.8% in a currency that we can easily print. And I live here, so I know about that bridge. I've spent enough time in Europe to know that Europe is not without its infrastructure challenges. It is not without its failure to prepare for the next generation. And I actually think that in the grand scheme of it, generating more demand should be a much easier problem to solve than generating more supply. And that's our problem today. It won't always be our problem, and there are lots of problems with generating adequate supply. But that is a key problem today, and I think it is a problem that we ought to be able to solve. But I am not hugely optimistic that we will solve it. One final comment. Part of a strategy on a global basis for generating demand has to be addressing what is perhaps the central financial paradox of our time. Most of you have taken an economics class at some time or other, or have thought about economic reasoning. Suppose you had lived on Mars, and I told you there was this planet called Earth, and while it was all a very complicated place, and it was ambiguous and all the things you talked about, you could divide all the countries into the world into two groups. One group was old, rich, and slow-growing and traditional. The other group was young, fast-growing, relatively poor, and trying to modernize as fast as possible. And then I said, which way was capital flowing? Was capital flowing from the first group to the second group? or from the second group to the first group. If you knew history, you would get the right answer, even if you couldn't think about the theory. You would know that capital should be flowing from the old and the rich to the young and the poor. And indeed, in the days of the British Empire, it did on a massive scale. For almost all of the last decade, the net flow of capital has been from the developing world to the industrial world. The corollary of that has been that the industrial world has been running a trade deficit, which has reduced demand in the industrial world. The corollary of that has been that there is less investment that has taken place in the developing world, and less opportunity for consumption on the part of people who represent the world's rising middle class. And so the global component of a strategy to raise demand has to be to, once again, restore the downhill rather than the uphill flow of capital.
Well, and now for my next 5 questions.
I'll give a short, I promise, I'll give short answers. I'll give very short answers to all the rest of your questions.
This is why it's so challenging to be here with Larry at a session like this, because what you have to do right in the beginning, all you have to do is say, here's Larry. And that's it. That's all you have to do. And the rest of it's over to you for questions. So, but I do have a couple of questions, because what I think I hear you underline, your underlying message is Germany really got to get off the dime and break loose from its austerity policy, and the United States ought to create more demand. Among other things, there ought to be a series of policy changes. But how do you convince the German government and Angela Merkel, who's seen widely as the best leader in Europe today, to move off that kind of policy? How do you get the United States government to move to the kind of policy of, it used to be infrastructure, used to be a bipartisan, there used to be a bipartisan understanding. Of course we have to invest in infrastructure, and we were pretty good at it for a while.
So part of the answer is, part of the faith of what makes one choose to spend a lot of one's life in an institution like this one, and I really believe it, is that in the long run, the truth outs, and that in the long run, better ideas drive out poorer ideas, and that climates of opinion change, and that you never know quite when it will happen, but transitions from inconceivable to inevitable can be fairly rapid, and when enough people say it in enough different ways, at some moment messages click and things start to change. That's one part of the answer. Second part, and that's probably the answer that a person who's a professor has the most faith in. The second is that, as I think it was George Will said in the United States, in a democracy, fear does the work of reason. And people at the last moment do the right thing. There was a German red line about debt relief. It was crossed for Germany. There was a German red line about direct provision of liquidity. It was crossed with the LTRO. There was a German red line with respect to the level of budget deficits. It's in the process of being crossed in France and Italy. So eventually these things happen, and they happen in slightly complex and ambiguous ways that makes it more likely for them to happen. And so I think there's a process of some evolution is underway. Third, you find better political formulas, and so I expect there will be some greater emphasis on trans-European infrastructure investment that won't quite show up in any one national budget, and that will enable more infrastructure investment to take place than otherwise would. But I don't think there's any silver bullet around this kind of stuff. And I think that part of what is needed is a lot of clarity. I mean, that's why I tend to think that getting straight what the problem is. I think if there actually was a consensus on the view that the important problem was a lack of demand, I think we'd be much closer to getting it solved than when half the people think the problem is something altogether different. I also think, and maybe it's being a teacher that makes me think this, that some ideas are more complicated than others. A central concept in economics is the fallacy of composition. If one of you stands up, you will be able to see better. If you all stand up, none of you will be able to see better, and you'll all be less comfortable. And so reasoning from the one to the many really doesn't work at all. In the same way, if a country really works hard at restraining its wages and promoting its exports, it can sell more and have more demand. But every country can't be a substantial net exporter. And so there's a complete failure in Germany to appreciate that the German success is entirely non-extrapolable as a model. Germany's economic success over the last decade has derived from becoming hyper-competitive within Europe and exporting at a large scale and running a huge current account surplus. And economists don't know much, but the one thing they do know is that all the current account surpluses have to add up to zero. And so the idea that everybody can do what Germany did is just not possible. Well, that's easy for me to say, and I think that on that particular point, even though economists would disagree with a lot, I think most economists would probably agree. But it takes a long time for those kinds of messages to get out.
Larry, let me ask you two more questions, and let's open this up. One goes to your point about clarity. It's unclear where your analysis of the need for creating more demand, and hence in this country, I assume, would be more stimulus, piling up more debt. How that squares with the ideas put forward by our colleagues Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt on debt. 2 or 3 years ago, they held great sway on the question of if debt increases as a percentage of GDP at a certain level, you can really curb growth, diminish growth, and that sort of thing. So how do these two things square? Help us clarify that.
Ken and Carmen are both good friends of mine and people whose scholarship I respect enormously. And they are right to warn about what can be the dangers of excessive debt. You probably have a sense that I'm about to go the other way. That's exactly right. Look, debt for nations is like debt for people. If you borrow money to buy a house that's going to give you and your family enormous satisfaction and is going to go up in value, that is smart borrowing, and you're better off having borrowed than you would have been if you had not borrowed. If you borrow money to take a trip to Las Vegas because you really feel like it, and you gamble the money and you lose, then that debt will have been very dangerous. And so you cannot make generalizations about levels of debt independent of how that debt is used. We saw a remarkable thing last week, and those of you who've sort of been in the development and economic policy business will, I think, appreciate how remarkable it is. The IMF, this isn't like some Keynesian economics professor at an Ivy League university. This is like the IMF, like the world's guardians of financial rigor. Not some scholar in their research department, but their flagship publication, published before all the world's finance ministers came together in Washington, said that appropriately chosen infrastructure investments would pay for themselves in the sense that if you made them, you would have a lower debt burden than if you did not, because the extra output they produced would generate extra tax revenue and so forth. And they estimated that if you invested 1% more of your GDP in infrastructure for 5 years, and you did the investments wisely, that your debt to GDP ratio would be 7% lower than if you didn't. And they further concluded that if you made those investments and you financed them with debt at today's low interest rates, there would be greater benefit to your economy than if you made them by cutting back other spending or by raising taxes. This isn't some conclusion that I just wrote in some working paper. This is the IMF. And so the answer is that if you invest wisely and you borrow money, it not only will make your economy better off, but ironically, it will make your debt position worse off. And if you ask the question, where would Japan be today if it had continued to grow at 3% a year, it wouldn't have a debt problem. And if you ask the question, where is Greek debt? Greece has had more austerity over the last decade than certainly any developed country, and perhaps any country ever. And their debt burden is higher than it was 3 years ago, despite major debt relief. And so this is as close as economics ever gets to a free lunch.
Okay. I'm going to leave the follow-ups on that particular issue to the audience, but I want to ask one more question. One of the reasons it's increasingly obvious that it's difficult to persuade publics in a variety of countries to have the government spend more is a rising sense that the government is incompetent, that there's a lack of competency and capacity in various government agencies. We see now with Ebola at the international level, the World Health Organization simply has not been there to deal with that in a way one might have assumed. CDC is suddenly in trouble again. But look at the number of agencies in this country that have gone through crises in the last few years, whether it's the Veterans Department or IRS or HHS trying to roll out Obamacare, trying to deal now with Ebola. You can look at the number of issues that go across that at their heart are about the level of capacity of people in government. How do we fix that problem so that you can restore trust and people are willing to give their money to government and say, okay, go do it?
I think we're caught in a vicious cycle. Because government's lousy, it's underfunded. And because it's underfunded, it's lousy. And that cycle keeps self-perpetuating.
But we're putting a lot more money into public schools, and they're lousy.
And so I think the answer, I think it's a really hard problem. And I think that the right answer is probably that we need government that is committed, that puts more emphasis on doing existing missions well than on taking on new missions. And the problem is that it's not that exciting to make government work better. It's just much more important. And so, the next governor of Massachusetts will have some initiative to do digital something or other for Massachusetts, and she or he will not focus on getting that bridge built faster. And part of the reason she or he will not focus on getting that bridge fixed faster is that even if you succeed in doing it, it'll take a long time before people notice, and that it starts to get better. So I think there are some really serious incentive problems that are involved in this, but leadership that takes a less expansive view of what the role of government does and takes a larger view of what government should takes a more focused view as to how well government does what it needs to do. Again, I'm not taking anything away from any particular issue, but I think if governments were somewhat more focused in what they tried to accomplish and put somewhat more emphasis on execution, they would do better. You know, I learned this first when I was at the World Bank. The World Bank's lending teams, when there was a project, you know, projects had a lot of work developing them, a lot of work after the project. What was the moment at which the champagne was drunk? The day the board approved the project. The day they got the go-ahead to do the project, not like when the project had been done, not when like the poverty had been reduced, not like when the school had been built, when the board approved the project, and then it was on to the next project.
Yeah.
And so I think that, I mean, when you hear the word implementation science, it just doesn't get you excited. But the truth is that it is hugely, hugely important to the rejuvenation of confidence.
Yeah. I come back to, this is just a parochial view, but it does seem to me the work of the Kennedy School becomes ever more important. The work of what Ricardo Center does becomes ever more important to prepare people who are competent and understand how to run things to go out from this institution. But let's open this up to your points. Yes, please.
Last week there was some...
Why don't you just introduce yourself too?
My name's John Carson, and I run a company called Bidding for Good. Last week there was a report that most of the major retailers are probably going to have a pretty cruddy Christmas. And the analysts went on to say that that's mostly because 3/4 of the country is going broke. And this is an economic inequality issue, but the question is, if we continue to have the trends where the bottom 90% of the population loses ground, do we ultimately kill off the host? And sort of, sundry a question for David is, if we continue to go down this path, how politically viable does this sort of play out? Or how does it play out politically?
Look, or to put your point another way, you can't have much of a poker game if one person has all the chips. And the trends are moving in that direction. And I think you're absolutely right in your concern. And there are a set of natural policy areas that it goes to. It goes to education. It goes to how progressive or not progressive the tax system is. It goes to corporate governance and corporate compensation practices. It goes to the role of the financial sector. But I think you have to be careful. David will know the facts better than I. It is not the case that the groups that are being hurt the most, those without college educations, are particularly the groups that are most enthusiastic about progressive taxation. And if you leave aside members of minority groups, if you take men who carry a lunch pail to work, it pains me to say this, but if you're a white man who carries a lunch pail to work, the chance that you voted for a Democrat in one of the last two presidential elections is in the range of 30% or 35%. And so I am very much in favor of more progressive taxation and a set of equality-oriented policies, but I think the politics are fairly complicated, and it's not clear which way this frustration will over time manifest itself in terms of who is elected, and more of it may be channeled in Tea Party type directions than you or I suspect David would prefer.
Yeah, I think we have a paradox here of that some of the industries that are emerging, that we are placing our future faith in, as in technology, high tech, are the very industries that are creating so much more inequality than some of the more traditional industries. And that there's also some evidence that the more you have startups in a community like Boston, which I celebrate, we've got a great startup culture here, the civic culture actually suffers because the number of the people who are involved in that community really don't want to be involved in a lot of other groups in civic life. They've got their companies they want to grow. So there's some tensions here that we just are going to have to live with. My own feeling is, look, if you let inequality deepen and continue on for a while, you'd have enormous social unrest. A lot of racism would come to the surface. There'd be a lot of other tensions we've seen in other countries. And I think ultimately at the far end, one of the reasons, as the president said at the UN the other day, one of the reasons we got the problems in the Middle East that we do is there's so much darn unemployment among young people, especially guys. And they just have a lot of social problems that build up, and they're open to the kind of dark, persuasive conversations that are underway. So you could see this sliding in a terrible, terrible direction. My response to that is, I'm a short-term pessimist about American politics, but a long-term optimist, because I think there are a lot of counter forces starting to build up, and I think that's the historic trend in this country. Go back to the 1880s, 1890s, we had rancid politics, and people like they were called the Knickerbockers all want to stay on the sidelines, all the elites. And yet there was a group of young people who said, no, this is totally unacceptable. And that's how Teddy Roosevelt got into politics. That's how we got the muckrakers into politics. That's how we got, Woodrow Wilson. I see in our colleges and universities today a real pushback among the kids who come through here, very, very idealistic, and think that today's world is totally unacceptable. And they're getting into social ventures of one sort or another. This is the Teach for America sort of thing, but we're starting to see them come into our politics. Michelle Nunn, running in Georgia, comes out of the, I hope she wins. We've got a young man named Seth Moulton here, who's a product of the school a few years ago, just won a big upset here in Massachusetts. I happen to be a big Seth supporter. He's been a student I've known for a long, long time. I see a lot of people like that starting to come out of the woodwork and say, we're going to get into the arena, we're going to fix this, we're going to change it. And that to me is where the hope is. Please, all the way back. I'm getting some signals. Ricardo, you'll have to guide us on the time frame.
Larry, thank you so much. John Chisholm, San Francisco. Your example of the government hiring large numbers of people to investigate the policies of every university is your window on what every business person confronts every day. H-1B visas, occupational safety and health, worker status, minimum wages, Americans for Disabilities, Obamacare. I could go on and on. Of ways that the federal government turns what should be a hugely positive sum game into a zero-sum game of who has the best attorneys or consultants or influence. For your free lunch that you talked about, how about some systematic review of the hundreds of thousands of regulations, paring them back, having sunset clauses so they automatically expire after some number of years, or innovation impact assessments like we have environmental impact assessments of new regulations?
Look, I share the inclination. I I think I sort of go back and forth. On the one hand, I obviously, you can tell from what I said, relate very much to the concern you expressed. On the other hand, when I hear some in the business community talk about this, I have to say I feel like reminding them that corporate profits as a share of GDP have never been higher in the history of the country. That maybe it's been a terrible 6 years for business, but the stock market has nearly tripled, and that one does need to sort of recognize that side of it. But I think you're absolutely right.
Much of that is attributable to regulation. For example, when the tobacco companies were prohibited from advertising on TV, it made it hard for new entrants to get into the market, and the profitability of the existing tobacco companies rose. And we're seeing that in lots of small ways in lots of small industries.
Yeah, I don't. There's a certain amount of, there's a certain amount of regulation that is incumbent protecting and therefore stimulating of profits. And so if you ask me, in almost every fight that Uber has with with some taxi bureaucracy, Uber's right. And so yes, I think you are right. I think it's easy to exaggerate just how large the economic impact is. I think the impact on confidence in government is very large. Every president tries, and most presidents do not succeed in reducing these regulatory burdens a great deal. But I share the impulse behind your question.
There's a question over here. Yes, please, sir. There's a microphone coming. Please.
Larry, it's a great pleasure to see you here at Harvard, and for me to be here as well. I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School. You may remember that, and I spent the last part of my career in the World Bank, and a few things you said about getting the regulatory framework right, getting the monetary policy in the right direction, was also a case of remarkable success in the World Bank itself during the period when you were chief economist. You may look back on that. A number of us do as well. The big issue was the World Bank decided that instead of financing only projects, which were good and had promised high rates of return, we decided that a badly run economy was something which even a good project couldn't correct. And so what we did, if you remember, was to make a major policy issue the devaluation of the CFA franc, which covered 13 countries in West Africa. And we negotiated that with President Ouattara of Cote d'Ivoire. And the result was we moved a good part of Africa from a negative annual growth rate of something like 4 to 5% to a positive growth rate in excess of 5% in the succeeding years after 1994. Now, this shows the importance not only of getting the prices right, but making West Africa competitive again. And this competitiveness was seen immediately in the growth rate. The biggest corporations, foreign ones like Unilever and so forth, in Africa, were holding off on new investments, but not withdrawing funds from Africa. They were waiting for this devaluation. I must say, the bank was a tower of strength in this period. We led the way to a wholly new economic situation. And I think you should be pleased at the outcome of the policies that I believe you supported in that period. Thank you.
Thank you.
Look, you make a thank you for that story, which I remember well. You make what I think is a very important point that sometimes things that are complicated and where the causal chains are very long are every bit as real as things that are much more direct. By permitting the devaluation of that misvalued exchange rate, we liberated an enormous amount of economic energy. No entrepreneur ever said thank you the way they would if we made loans to entrepreneurs or had a business extension program of some kind. But the truth is that that was a hugely important thing that the World Bank did, and that you were involved in. I had only a very small part, and it makes the point that the broad constellation of macroeconomic policy, and whether it is conducive or supportive to growth, has an enormous impact. What I've become convinced of in half a lifetime of doing this stuff is that no monetary policy or fiscal policy, no matter how brilliant, can make a country rich. To be rich, you have to have the right kind of framework, the right kind of businesses, the right kind of workers, all of that. But that when monetary and fiscal policies are misguided, they can keep you poor no matter how much potential you have. And the concern that I have had is that in the industrial world, misguided monetary and fiscal policies run the risk of stifling enormous economic potential, as I believe that to a very substantial extent has been the case in Japan for a generation now. Thank you very much for the chance to be with you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Larry.